Hello everybody and welcome to this new installation of our Professor of Architecture, Agatino Rizzo. It's nice to have you here. Nice to hear your presentation and congratulations on your position as chaired professor here. As I understand, you've been around the whole world working on urban architecture, looking on designing how to improve cities.
Right.
Originally you're from Italy and there you got your PhD in 2008.
Yeah.
I'm pretty excited to hear what you have to say. I mean, we're colleagues, we know each other, we're in the same department, but still, I don't know everybody and what they're doing in the department, so why don't you start presenting here and we'll have questions afterwards. We'll be answering the questions online in the chat, and then he can answer them live.
Yeah.
Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Philip. So, thank you very much for you who are watching from distance. And today I'm going to talk about the architecture of future cities. My name is Agatino Rizzo. I'm the professor of architecture at LTU. But before talking about the future, I think it is important to step into the past and see from where we come from. So I bring you to the city of Miletus, 500 BC. And you can see that these are the first traces of a modern urban plan. You can see that the city is structured more or less like we structure cities today, like the city of New York, or many cities actually in the US and in Europe. It's a grid, a regular grid structure. But at the same time, there are also like stark differences between the cities of the past and today's cities. One such difference is size. Ancient cities were small, since walking or riding were the only forms of transportation around the city available at the time. Also, in the old times, a big constraint to the size of the cities was the capability of the surrounding environment to provide food. And also, the primitive form of communication did not allow for having big cities in order to manage them. For example, Aristotle suggested that the size of no more than 10,000 citizens was the best size in order to manage the city in a democratic way. Of course, the 10,000 didn't include slaves. Athens at its apex had about 140,000 inhabitants, this time including slaves. A few centuries later, in fact, Rome reached 1 million inhabitants during the imperial times. At the beginning of the 1900s, there were 11 cities with more than 1 million inhabitants. According to United Nations reports in 2018, 23% of the world population was living in cities larger than 1 million inhabitants, while 32% in cities lower than this threshold, and 45% living in rural areas. By 2030, this proportion is set to increase of urban population, 26% in larger city, more than 1 million inhabitants, and 33% in less than 1 million inhabitants. So the future looks more and more urban. You can see in this diagram the steepness of the urbanization curve. So more and more people will move to urban areas, whether they are small cities, medium-sized cities, or big cities. But as we urbanize, also the consumption of energy will increase in time. And this is because when people move to urban areas, there will be more industrialization, more also commuting, transportation, more also consumption. So the urban lifestyle is also an energy-intensive lifestyle, a resource-intensive lifestyle. You can see in this diagram, even though with the COVID-19, we are at the moment, we had this, let's say a slide, a setback on the demand of energy. In the future, we are going to need more and more energy to support our urban lifestyle. And if we look at the forms of energy, the primary energy from which we are getting like this energy from, in the future, the lion's share of energy will come more and more from solar photovoltaics and renewable, and also some bridge fuels such as gas. If we want to look at the position of Sweden in the world, and we want to consider like the energy consumption per capita, we can see that Sweden is one of the countries in the world with the largest energy consumption per capita. This, in many ways, is normal. We live in a cold country, so we need to heat our houses, our homes, our working places, our commercial areas. Sweden is also a sparsely populated country, which means a lot of energy goes into commuting. But at the same time, Sweden is also a very urbanized country, it's an advanced economy, it's an industrialized one, so energy goes also into manufacturing and also in consumption. We don't need only energy to support our cities, we need also non-pure minerals. We need materials actually to build schools, libraries, to build homes, to build highways, and also to build our IT infrastructure, our internet. It has been estimated that around 18 tons of minerals per capita is consumed every year in a developed country around the world. So from a research perspective, there is a link, or a nexus, if you like, between the way we design and we build cities and the way we use the resources to build these cities and to support urban living, and the way the consumption of resources affects the climate. And in turn, climate change affects cities in terms of extreme events. You have here 3 screenshots of possible events that have already happened. For example, flooding or air pollution or heat waves. So I think it is important to keep in mind this triple nexus. Why an architect or a planner is talking about that? Again, I think it's good to look at the definition of the subject of architecture and planning. Architecture comes from the Greek word architecton, which means chief builder. This is one of the oldest disciplines in the planet. According to Vitruvius, a Roman planner in 15 BC, architecture can be defined in terms of structural stability, appropriate functions, and aesthetic quality. On the other hand, urban planning is one of the youngest disciplines in the world, originating from the Industrial Revolution. Urban planning has its roots in architecture, engineering, and the life sciences. So we can define architecture and planning as those fields of knowledge in action that shape the environment in which people live and work. And when I use the term knowledge in action, it means that typically in other fields, in science and engineering, you have labs to test solutions. But in architecture and planning, our lab is the city. So as we develop knowledge and as we implement this knowledge in our built environment, at the same time we draw data from it in order to reanalyze the knowledge produced and how it has been implemented and develop new solutions. So with this, it's the meaning of knowledge in action. Now, if we look at the architecture and planning process around the world, it looks pretty much the 2 pictures you have here. These I have taken from the planning process here in Sweden. We have a multi-tier system. We start by planning at the large scale, and then we go more deeper into the detail scale, and then we have the building permit, the construction of the building, and the supervision process. And this is a process that is of continuous adaptation, and also it requires also political decisions at some point, especially when we talk about bigger plans. But the question is that what has been the result of this process in the last decades? Actually, in the last decades, this process has in many ways failed. When we have planned cities from the perspective only from the perspective of private car mobility, we have achieved results like the one you have here in the picture, which doesn't look a very livable place. Also, with the emphasis on suburban shopping malls, there has been more emphasis also on commuting, and that has, of course, produced also more energy consumption and more space required for parking lots, and also less attractive places. But also, when everyone wants to have, of course, her or his own villas and all of this, when this decision is scaled up for many thousands, hundreds of thousands or millions of inhabitants, this has a very huge impact into the environment. Also, there has been big advances in the building construction sector. We are using more and more prefab, and this has been a very good solution to also decrease construction costs, and this has been good to provide affordable living. But at the same time, this has raised question about the quality of these buildings, prefab buildings, especially when they are to be fitted in an existing environment that has historical qualities. And speaking about heritage and historic building districts, many ways in the last decades, the solution has been that when these buildings were on the way for master plans or for new developments, they had to go away. And when you demolish an historic building, many times these historic buildings have a very high quality, not only in terms of architecture and construction details, but also sometimes in terms of energy, particularly if we consider the entire life perspective of these buildings. And once you demolish an old building, it's not going to come back anymore. So we have lost the opportunity to learn from old buildings, particularly if we want to project it into the future cities. So for architects and planners in research, the question is, how do we move from today's cities that are characterized by a missing energy and climate perspective, a weak community also consideration, we will talk about this a little bit later, accessibility based mostly on private cars, and missing opportunities from cultural heritage. How do we move from today's cities with these issues to future cities? And we need to acknowledge actually that at the international scale, a lot of work has been done on the theme of sustainability. The United Nations have put forward the Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals. You see them here, 17 sustainable goals. And they can be used as a compass in a way to design future cities. Lots of them actually can find their implementation within cities. And these goals have been translated in Sweden into very ambitious targets. Swedish government has pledged by 2045 to transform the country in a net zero carbon emission country and economy, and by 2040 to produce electricity 100% from renewable energy sources. We are doing well in many ways, but it's still, there is a lot of work to do in this transformation, and architecture and planning must also contribute to it. If you look at the energy system of Sweden, and you look at the left side of this picture, you can see in fact that lots of energy supply at the moment is still in Sweden. It's still coming from non-renewable energy sources such as nuclear and fossil fuels. But more and more renewable energy, such as, of course, hydro, which has been stronger in Sweden for a long time, but also wind power and renewable and photovoltaics, it's growing more, and of course biofuels. When you look at the right side of this picture into consumption, you can see that most of the energy consumption, of course, occurs in cities, in industries, which are located anyway nearby urban environments. It's consumed, of course, in residential and service area, shopping malls and offices and so on, and transportation. So let's have a look more in detail into these three functions we find in the city. Speaking about future industries, we can see that recent trends in digital fabrication, artificial intelligence, and most recently in hydrogen, will probably bring back industry even closer to the city, back to Europe, back to also to the West in many ways, because production will be decentralized, will be also just in time, closer to potential users, and will be clean, thanks to hydrogen. And when we look at future housing, the recent pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, has shown us that distance working is possible, even at massive scale, and this for sure will affect the way we live and work. But the cities are here to stay. What will change is the percentage and the size, so the space of office, living, commercial space, how it is located into the city, and probably will bring a better focus on living and architectural quality into the suburban peripheries and smaller cities. And if we go into future mobility, fossil-free transport and the impact of COVID-19 will have a lasting impact on public transport. And probably, looking at this in a more positive perspective, probably this will facilitate a variety of different modes of moving throughout the city. Walking, of course, important, but also like individual e-scooters, e-vehicles, and of course, mass public transport. So it will be a combination more of this. So what kind of challenges this trend poses for planning and designing new buildings and the new city? I bring in this presentation, in this lecture, only 2 challenges, but there are actually more. The first is to planning for prosumers. The idea with prosumers is that future residents will not only be consumers of energy and food, but they also will be producers of food and energy. For example, like if you look at recent trends on photovoltaics, individual photovoltaics establishment in known houses or in multi-story apartments, or also in urban farming. And according to research which we are developing at LTU together with colleague Professor Christina Eck, we are studying an area here in the city of Luleå, and we have put in place a very large survey, and I bring here like only a small section of this survey where we ask residents of an area to basically tell whether they were interested in affecting the design of this future small renewable energy equipment into the city, whether they want to affect the location of this new photovoltaics establishments in their district, whether they wanted to buy electricity from it or buy shares into it. And in general, the population, the respondents, were very positive in actually taking ownership of this, of the transformation of their houses, public space, and apartments, and to include renewable energy into it, and also to participate in the design of it, and also in the location and so on. So the community actually want to have a say. Another challenge is that of the existing city and architecture quality, and it refers to the slides, to the issue I was talking before. And to develop this a little bit better, I brought here a picture from basically like an architecture submission which was organized a year ago. As you know, a couple of years ago, the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris was burned, and afterwards it was organized. It was organized an architecture competition to try to understand how to rebuild this cathedral, and there were many submissions. And among these, there was this proposal from an architecture office called Vincent Callebaut Architects. And they basically reimagined the cathedral as a monument for sustainable living. So they imagined that the roof could become a large greenhouse to produce food, and the roof, in the roof will be installed photovoltaic panels to generate energy and to reuse it also for the production of this food. Of course, this submission was in a way very radical, very controversial for a national monument. It's not going to happen, of course, but it raised quite important questions, particularly for cities located in Europe, but I would say all around the world. Typically, we don't build on a tabula rasa. We had our buildings, we transform our cities, but there is something existing. And the question is that how can we engage with existing buildings in this energy transformation? I bring here also the results of another research project I developed here together with colleagues Thomas Horn, Sofia Lidelo, and Andrea Luciani a couple of years ago, in which we basically study the way heritage buildings were analyzed in architectural literature, and in architectural literature mainly. And basically, typically, the focus of looking at these heritage buildings is always in the short-term perspective. We look at the problem, at the energy problems, at the microclimate comfort issues that they have at the moment, and we should actually consider more the life cycle perspective of these buildings, because if we look into the entire life cycle of this building, we will find that many times they are very much more sustainable than the new buildings we are building at the moment, and also more sustainable. So we need to change our lens to look also at the existing urban environment. And we need to change also our attitude and to look at this existing city in less problematic ways. In my research, I focus on a concept that is that of resourcefulness. And if you look in the dictionary, resourcefulness speaks for the ability to deal skillfully and promptly with new situations and difficulties. What do I mean with the term resourcefulness and also resourceful cities? First of all, why do we need a new term? The concepts of sustainability and resilience have been very good so far, but at the same time, they are a little bit, show some problems. In many ways, sustainability and resilience are conservative concepts because they imply that without broad changes in society, we can achieve a sort of hypothetical equilibrium purely by adapting with technologies mainly. The idea of resourcefulness implies instead that communities have the capacity to engage in deliberative democratic dialogues and develop alternative agendas. So it's more a bottom-up approach. It's not an individualistic approach, but it's one that empowers communities. So in our research, the way we frame it here at LTU in the architecture group is to look to try to develop an architecture for resourceful cities, where design enables a symbiosis between resources and city systems for the generation, distribution, or use and storage of energy, food, and other resources, where we can plan a shift from large-scale centralized to small-scale decentralized resource systems, as in the issue of prosumers I was talking before. And also we rethink totally the idea of aesthetics in terms of a resource or energy aesthetics. That is an aesthetics co-created with community through an open design thinking process. All this discussion may look an academic exercise, but it is not actually. If we look at the recent Swedish government policies that have been put in the last couple of years, we can see that the government sees in design as a huge opportunity to transform our living environment, to make it more accessible, inclusive, and sustainable by using design, where design is not only decoration or have some other only aesthetical qualities, but it's also a fundamental thinking process to rethink the way we live in a more sustainable way. So design as a process. So if we go back from where we started to the architecture and planning process, the question is that how can we change this process and in the face of the issues I was talking before? And from now on, in the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to show some of the work we are doing in Luleå and we research. For example, in the Solar District project, which I'm working together with a few colleagues, Björn Ekelund and Christina Ek, we are using participatory design thinking as a way to bring a community living in a specific area of Luleå to reimagine the public space and their buildings from the perspective of energy. And we are extending this work also in our courses in teaching to try to shape future architects at the same time. So we transfer research into education at the same time. And what we are trying to develop is new ways to think of design in terms of urban farming and energy issues and how these issues are embedded in design and they don't come afterwards, where typically we have lots of problems to integrate in later discussions. We don't only work with architecture and design methods, but we also work with other methods. For example, in this large European project, Tuna Lab, which at LTU is led by Professor Anna Stolbrost, and I'm working together with Rasul Abibipur. We are working with living labs, which are labs that integrate citizens, researchers, and companies in order to develop new solutions for urban issues. And we work, for example, in this project, we develop a card system which helps municipalities to set living labs. We work also with maps, sometimes with Legos and so on, as a way to stimulate creative thinking with people perhaps that don't have the expertise of architects and planners. And for example, in the bottom picture, you can see the case of Genoa. As you know, a couple of years ago, the bridge in Genova collapsed. Many people died. Now the bridge is being rebuilt, but at the same time, the municipality, Genoa, which was at the same time partner of our project, was interested in redesigning the areas around the bridge. So what they did was to use the project, to use the Urban Living Lab to develop the guidelines for an architecture competition. And in this way, they could include citizens, they could include companies, they could include also other stakeholders and decision makers to make guidelines that actually address the issues which were required in this very tragic area. And the one you see is the result, or is the successful submission of the architecture competition. Finally, another way, another tool and methods we work is that of big data and simulation. And never like today, we have had so much information and data available. Of course, we have private data, and that is good. They are private, they remain private for our privacy. At the same time, there are lots of other data which can be used in the architecture and design process to design better cities. For example, in this small project which we had a couple of years ago with some colleagues at LTU, with Tim Johansson, Markus Sandberg, and Johan Wengren, we work with the city of Kiruna to basically facilitate urban farming. And you know, Kiruna is located in the northern part of Sweden, which is a cold country, so Kiruna is much colder than the rest of Sweden. And of course, the question is that how we can actually produce food in Kiruna 365 days a year when we have like a longer winter period. So the idea was basically to set up a digital platform in which we use data which we had related to the energy performance of buildings and related to sun radiation, and also space data, spatial data related to the fact that we had to locate the greenhouses in some spaces. So we wanted to work with this also kind of data. And the main idea was that if we want to set greenhouses in a cold climate, we need to use energy. And if we want to do it in a sustainable way, we need to reuse existing energy, probably energy that is discarded. And for example, we were thinking about school and shopping malls in which lots of energy is actually discarded in the ventilation system. So we wanted to locate these greenhouses, portable greenhouses establishments close to those sources of waste heat. So we use like this more or less sophisticated model to try to find optimal locations. And we had the traffic light system color in which you see like green buildings and yellow buildings and red buildings, where green stands for those buildings and locations that had the possibility to host these greenhouses, whether they could be perhaps located on a parking lot or on their roof, or could be like closer to their facade. And you can see also that we developed a proposal of this greenhouse. It was developed actually in a master thesis by Patrick Ronqvist a couple of years ago, and in collaboration with this project. So I think this was also like a quite interesting like application of new planning and architecture systems. So there is not much to say. I wanted just to end with this picture. This is like actually an implemented project by a colleague of mine, Bjorn Ekelund. And well, he developed this concept together with the workers and the students of our second campus of LTU in Piteå. And again, there the idea was to redesign public space from the perspective of prosumers. And actually, you can visit this any day in Piteå. It is called the Sun Wave. Thank you so much.
Okay, we're going to open up for questions. But before we read the questions that are online, I would like to ask you one question,
Yeah.
and then I have some others later if we have time for that. Considering Luleå here, the city that we have today, what has happened is that the politicians have, to be environmentally friendly, try to fulfill the different environmental regulations the government has set, have said, okay, let's make it less feasible for people to drive their cars to the city, okay? Which has resulted in people have now driven their cars 8 kilometers outside of town to Storheden to buy and stuff. And the changes within the city is there is less traffic, but people don't want to work here as much either because it costs more, and stores are closing. And many of these mom and pop stores, small stores, not owned by the big chains, are closing because they can't afford because there's less things happening. How would you, because you've been talking about urbanization here,
Sure.
you've been talking about energy efficiency, environmentally friendly.
Yeah.
How would you design the city here? Would you try to promote Storheden? Would you try to promote something else? So that, because it is using more energy to go outside of town
Sure.
than instead of coming to town.
Sure, sure. So this is a very, very good question. First of all, I think in the case of Luleå, we need to see where people live in Luleå. And of course, we can see that while we have a peninsula area, which is very dense, and it's populated, but there is a large amount of people actually live in the suburbs. The commune is a very large, Luleå is a very large commune. So we need to look at this issue not only in terms of there is a center and there is a periphery, but it's also where actually the weight of the population it is. And it is very much spread in some areas. Of course, one question to think, one issue to look at this in Luleå is that of mobility and transport. As you were saying, the issue is that of, it's framed from the perspective of cars. And that is many ways, it's problematic because of course cars take space, it is expensive to build parking lots and parking houses, it takes more energy and so on. So one possibility of course is to strengthen public transport, but of course at the same time we are in a period that is the corona one, in which people stay away from it, but we need to look into the future. We need to promote more public transport, we need to invest more in public transport, but we need also to think of public transport maybe that is a little bit more flexible. I think that is an issue here in Luleå. And when it comes to flexibility, we need to think how we can enable individual mobility, fossil-free individual mobility, for people also to move around the town. It stays still that we have the problem of climate. It's cold in the winter time, but the Umeå shows that actually it is possible to cycle and walk also in condition of snows. So it requires also a little bit of mind changing or behavior changing.
Okay. Okay. Another question I have is that our university, which is now going to be celebrating their 50th anniversary, several buildings were built in the 70s, which is also, I guess, one example of this modernization, urbanization that we have. Their buildings were only built for a 50-year lifespan, roughly.
Yeah.
You're showing that we're tearing down like the city hall in Kiruna, which had a definitive longer lifespan. But we see the results of some of the buildings today in Luleå at the university, where more or less the buildings have been falling apart the last 15 years.
So.
Their lifespan was not designed more than that. They need serious remodeling. But now we're looking to build a new building to replace them. And immediately when I hear the discussion that comes out is that it's going to have a 50-year lifespan, it's going to cost 1 billion crowns. Immediately a flag goes up for me, 50-year lifespan. We are just now living in the results of a 40, 50-year lifespan, and it's costing us a fortune.
Sure.
It's costing the owner of the buildings a fortune. Are we going to end up with this 50 years now too? What would you do in this situation to design and build a new local, new facility for the university?
Yeah. I think we need to change the perspective in which we build buildings. I mean, we are building buildings in a way they are like a pair of shoes. So you use for 1 year or a couple of years and then you discard them and you rebuild it again. Of course, in the building industry you can do like on a 50 years lifespan. But if we want to be truly sustainable, circular, and all the resilient and all the adjectives we can use today, we need to think of buildings that can last actually for longer. And lasting for longer means one thing. We need to go from short-term thinking, you know, the profit of 1, 2, 3 years, the saving costs for that 2, 3, 4 years, that will generate a lot of problems in 20, 30 years. And we need to really look at the life cycle perspective of these buildings, which needs to be actually longer. So we need to change the perspective to make buildings more, and the city durable. At the end of the day, if you look at the cities where we travel and we like to be, they are not cities that are designed like where you have cheap buildings. You don't go to Paris because of the cheap buildings. You don't go to Asian cities because of the cheap buildings. But you look for those buildings, even the ones that are not very meaningful, but they have been there for a longer time. So we need to find a way to use resources and materials for a longer stretch of time than we do today. So we need to change our lenses, our mentality.
We have one question online, and here it comes.
Do you think that urbanization will continue to increase after COVID-19, or will it decrease after working from home will continue?
That is a very excellent question, and I wanted to keep actually a slide on that, but then I remove it. If you look at the numbers with the pandemic and all of this, and we could argue that cities are problematic for the next pandemic. We know research shows that the pandemic is not going to be a one-off problem. Now will be more and more, because as the world globalizes and people travel, and the more we urbanize, we encroach into wild areas, we will import more viruses, and this is going to happen. So we could say the problem is the city. But actually, if you look at the numbers, I bring you an example of Taiwan. I was reading an article into the Lancet. And Taiwan is a country of 20 more million inhabitants. Sweden is a little bit more than 10. Population density in Taiwan is 650 people per square kilometers. In Sweden is 25. If you look at the capital cities, Stockholm and Taipei, which is the capital of Taiwan, Taipei has double the density. And then if you have now the time to Google it and you look at the people actually being affected in Taiwan and in Sweden, you can see that in Sweden 250,000 have been affected by COVID. In Taiwan is 600 or less than 1,000. So the problem is actually not the city. The problem is that the way we manage pandemic, and of course we are very late here in Europe. If you look at the case of Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, they show that they are all very urbanized countries. Japan, of course, South Korea, Taiwan, and so on. And they are managing it. Of course, they're having issues, but they have protocols to manage it. And I'm not going into detail because I'm not an expert into it. But what I want to say, the city is not the problem. The density is not the problem. Of course, we need to see at the side effects of the pandemic. So not per se the pandemic, but for example, distance working. This is what the pandemic has brought very strong. That may have an impact into the city. Because, for example, into the future, we can think that I will go to office, maybe I work a couple of days from home or 3 days from home, and I go 2 days into the office. So, of course, I need to rethink the way I dimension and where I locate offices and living spaces throughout the city. But I still need to meet people, especially when we talk about the knowledge sector, but also there are jobs which cannot afford to work from distance. People driving a bus or people doing other works that don't depend on the computer. So the city is there to stay. It's not going to go away. There will be probably bigger emphasis on the peripheries of the city, which for now are dormitories. Maybe in the future will be more places for shopping and also living. And probably this will bring a better architecture and living quality also in the peripheries. But we will need, cities will be there. The underlying trend is not going to change, I think.
We have another question. When we talk about participatory design in renewable energy projects, there are certain limitations, especially during the this pandemic area. Can you elaborate on how we can overcome this?
Well, this is very problematic. In fact, when we do participatory design, the best scenario is to have people around you, because in certain aspect of creation, you need actually to use also body language. In many ways, it's also performative. We cannot digitalize everything. So at the moment, actually, from a research perspective, we are suffering because we don't have this interaction with the people there. But the pandemic is not going to be here forever. We will manage it. We will manage it. We have to think actually about the future pandemics, and hopefully we will learn from it. The city and the city design may contribute, but probably it's not definitive, it's not a crucial point there, but other kind of preparedness system needs to be in place. Of course, there can be an impact in the way we think about healthcare structures, like, for example, smaller hospitals that are more spread instead to have centralized hospitals. This could be a scenario. There could be also other scenarios. I haven't looked into that. It's too early to look into that. That are possibilities for future research.
Okay, thank you very much. This was a very interesting presentation. I'd like to see more of your work, be built in the city. I'd like to see things happen in this town that are very positive. I know in some of the local communities around here, they're very positive to change. We can hope that the new government here will also be helpful in that sense, that allow this. I've seen some good ideas that have been published in the newspaper, even from some of your workers, which is great. And I'd like to congratulate you on your new position and as a professor.
Thank you so much.
And with that, we have a gift. The university has a gift to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We will do like in this way.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for listening online. And we'll see you again next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.